Alright, so now let's talk about read preference in the Node.js driver. So by default, all reads from the driver will go to the primary. But you can actually configure the behavior of your reads if it fits your application. So you can configure your reads to go to the primary, which is the default. You can configure your reads to only go to secondaries. You can configure your reads to prefer the primary or the secondary, which means if one or the other is not available, it'll try the other. So for example, if it's primary preferred and there's no primary, then it will fall back and use the secondary, but it'll use a primary if it's present. And you can also specify to use the nearest node. You can also use tagged read preferences to configure precisely which nodes you want the reads to go to, but that's a more advanced topic and also outside the scope of this course. So we're just going to talk about the basic read preferences, which is primary, primary preferred, and nearest. So let's look at an example of using read preference in the Node.js driver. Alright, so what we're doing here is, like before, we're specifying a connection string. And just like with the write concern, after the connection string, we have these things that look like get variables. And here we have a variable read preference, and we're setting it to be secondary. So that means on this connection, all the reads will go to a secondary unless we specify otherwise. So the first thing we're doing is doing an insert here, just to insert this one document in our collection, and then we're doing a find down here in this find document function. So if we go down to the bottom, we have this find document function, which we're calling down here. The find document function is registering itself to be called in 1 second. So we'll call it, it will send out a find, and register itself to be called again in 1 second. So the result of this is we'll do a find one every second for a document with the field x and a value of 1. So in this case, we're actually overriding the read preference of the connection. So this is another way to specify the read preference. This is in our option object to our query. So here we're specifying read preference, which we imported above, dot primary. So this is just an enum with all of our different read preferences. I can glance at that. So we have read preference is just from the MongoDB package again, and we just get that enum out so that down here we can use read preference.primary and specify that we actually want this find to go to a primary, which is the default, but we're overriding it for this connection because we specified secondary. So I'll show both ways. I'll show with overriding this, and then I'll show an example of what happens when we just use the read preference of the secondary that we set on the connection. So let's run this application now and see what happens in a failover scenario. Alright, so we're running our application, and you can see we're doing a find every second, pretty much returning the same document each time. We see different documents here because I ran this before. So now let's cause a failover. We'll connect to localhost 30,001, and we see that it's a secondary. So what we want to do now is do rs.status to figure out where our primary is so we can kill it. Alright, so it turns out our primary is on education.local 30,002. So education.local is my actual host name, but I know it's on my local machine, so I can just use localhost. Now I connect, I see it's the primary, use admin, and then db.shutdownServer. So now this primary has been shut down, we have a failover, and let's see what our application is doing. So we see that the finds are actually not returning any results yet. So they're still dispatching, and now we see all the results come back. So if we look at what happened here, we see that we were dispatching all these finds, but there was no primary to actually take the query, so the driver just buffered them as it did before in a normal failover scenario with writes. So this is the default behavior, and this is because we're setting read preference of primary in our option object. So now let's go back and look at our application, and let's not override the read preference. Let's allow these reads to go to a secondary, see what happens in a failover situation. This is just to show that this is actually changing the behavior, because sometimes it's hard to see what's actually happening. You know, you can't really look and say, look, the writes are going to the secondary. You actually have to do some kind of experiment like this to really get a sense of what's going on. So here I've removed the option object, so now this find one will be using the read preference that we set for the connection, which is read preference of a secondary. So now we run our application. You see it has pretty much the same behavior as before. But now let's see what happens in a failover situation. So now let's connect to localhost 3001, we see that it's the primary, so we don't have to check. We see in the prompt that it's primary. I don't have to look for the primary. So let's use admin, and let's shut down this server. So now we've shut down our primary. Let's take a look at our application. So from what I can see, it looks pretty much unaffected. We're still dispatching a find every second. I highlighted it there to make it easier to see. Basically, it's unaffected by the failover because we still have secondaries that can service our reads, even though we've completely shut down our primary server. And in fact, because I shut down these other two, we actually only have one node up. So we definitely do not have a primary up, but this application is still happily reading from the secondary. So you may ask, why don't we just do this all the time? Why don't we just always read from the secondary? And the answer is that the guarantees you get from reading from a secondary aren't the same as the ones you get from reading from a primary. So if we go back to our picture, because the writes are going to the primary, it takes some time for them to propagate to the secondaries, which means if your reads are coming from the secondaries, you may not have the most up-to-date copy of the data. So the same application may have just done a write and may read a different result that's out of date. So that's the danger of doing secondary reads. It does have some benefits, but you have to really think carefully about whether it's okay for your application to have that kind of eventual consistency. Alright, so that's how you deal with read preference in the Node.js driver. So let's take a look at a quiz. Alright, so the quiz is you can configure your application via the drivers to read from secondary nodes within a replica set. What are the reasons that you might not want to do that? Check all that apply. Is it if your write traffic is significantly greater than your read traffic, you may overwhelm the secondary, which must process all the writes as well as the reads. Replication lag can result. Is it you may not read what you previously wrote to MongoDB? Is it if the secondary hardware has insufficient memory to keep the read working set in memory, directing reads to it will likely slow it down? Or is it reading from secondary prevents it from being promoted to primary? So check all that apply.